Good afternoon. I'm Bob Blum, and Chair of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health, and it is a pleasure to be able to welcome our speaker, Alan Guttmacher, back to Baltimore. Alan is a native of Baltimore, and as I understand his work history, it began on Monument Street in a flower shop when he was about 8 years of age. His career went on to Harvard, where he went undergraduate, and then taught middle school before returning back to medical school, and then his pediatric training at Harvard, at Boston Children's, and doing genetics fellowship and a postdoc. And from there he went to the University of Vermont, where he did and headed genetics. And I think it was at that time, in about 1987, that 86, 87, that our paths first crossed, because there's another Alan Guttmacher that some in the room are familiar with, that for which an institute was named. It's not coincidental. That is, in fact, your uncle, correct? Alan served on the board of the Guttmacher Institute until joining the federal government in '99. We was the deputy, the genomics program, working with Francis Collins, and until his appointment as head of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute on Child Health and Human Development. So, welcome back, Alan. It is wonderful to have you visit us. In the audience are many who have been the beneficiary of the support and work of NICHD, and likewise some in the audience who you've known for many years. So it's a joy to have you here. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Bob. It's true. It's not always you get to give a talk where you recognize people in the audience who've known you for well over 50 years. Yes, I got my start across the street where I was delivered by Alan Guttmacher, actually. I keep waiting for some government functionary someday to ask me, I've heard of precocious, but how come you signed your own birth certificate? Yes, I was named after my Uncle Alan, who's my father's identical twin brother, so as a geneticist, it gets even more complicated. And it's wonderful to be back. My first job, in fact, I still remember I was paid $8 for my first day of work at that flower shop on Monument Street. My aunt owned the flower shop. There were two branches, one in the hospital and one across the street, where now it's more or less, I think, the bookstore on Monument Street, next to the Manhattan Pharmacy, for any of you oldsters may remember that. And that is where I got my start. And it's either been kind of ascent or descent to the leadership of NICHD from that. There are some days where I do miss the flower shop, I must say. What I'm going to try to do with you this afternoon is talk a little bit about a process we've been going through at NICHD, and some of you, in fact, have been part of that process. And I'm not going to I'll talk briefly about the process itself, but then really focus much more on the ideas that have come out of that process and some of the thoughts that we're having about what are the kinds of interesting scientific opportunities of the next 10 years or so. Now, this conversation is framed in the context of the mission of NICHD, and there are many folks in this room who, in fact, are funded by NICHD, et cetera, so you may know part of NICHD very well. There are relatively few people who are aware of the incredible breadth of NICHD as an institute at NIH. We're the home for a whole lot of different sorts of research. This is sort of a, obviously, bulleted format of our mission, but it gives you some idea about the breadth of things that we're interested in. So we really wanted to catalyze a conversation about what were the scientific opportunities over the next 10 years or so across this very broad mission, with the idea that we want to identify what were the most promising opportunities, and that what we really wanted to do in doing this was to be of some use to ourselves in terms of thinking about, gee, if this is the science of the future, what our role should be in that. But what we really want to do is just get a whole lot of folks thinking about, both as individuals, as departments, as schools, whatever it might be, where should we all be going, both individually but also as a research community over the next years. So the focus of this has been on scientific opportunity. It has not been about organizational issues. It hasn't been about, I've said to people in many discussions we've had, I'd love to hear about mechanisms if you want to talk about mechanisms of disease. I really don't want to hear about mechanisms if you talk about mechanisms of funding. We understand those are important to understand mechanisms of disease eventually, but this is not that. This is focused on thinking about the science. Once we have that, then we can think for ourselves and other organizations, we hope as well, think about what we can do specifically to advance it. So we've had a series of workshops that were held earlier this year. Basically, there were 9 thematic workshops. I'll show you those themes in a moment, that were organized each by groups of external scientists, and that each had about 50 to 60 folks external to NIH who were there as participants, with 20 or 25 people from NIH, largely NICHD, but certainly from lots of other institutes as well, who were there simply as observers. We wanted to hear what folks in the outside, wider world, primarily research scientists, but also include public policy thinkers, patient advocates, other kinds of folks thinking about these things. And then coming out of each of these were white papers which were developed. They were posted online for public input, and we got lots of public input from those. And then we had a much larger meeting at the end of June of a couple of hundred people, where we tried both to pull together what came out of all of these, but also to say, what were the things that had been missed somehow in these earlier conversations. And that was to develop a draft vision statement that I'm working on along with a few other folks now, to try to get together for our September National Advisory Council meeting, where we will be presenting this for their discussion to inform it, et cetera. And then we hope to have this published in a leading scientific journal at the end of this year. That hope fueled partly because we thought it was the right thing to do, but also now some months ago, by anybody's definition, leading international scientific journal heard that we were doing this thing, and I actually got an email from one of the editors of the journal who said, we'd like to publish your vision document once you've got it written. And I emailed back saying, well, gee, that's very nice. Might you want to see it before you published it by any chance? Do you have things like editorial standards, or maybe even more important, word limits, things like that? Oh yes, we're quite proud of our editorial standards, and maybe not so proud of our word limits, but we do have them, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in negotiations as to exactly what will happen with it. But then particularly, we're hoping to come up with something that is useful for various folks to use, whether it be presentations at meetings, whether it be faculty seminars to spur people's thought about things, newsletters for various groups, et cetera, that will lead to wider dissemination, both of what we've been thinking, but more importantly, I hope wider discussion of what, again, the research community should be doing in the future. Meanwhile, staff and our advisors at NICHD will be coming together, we've already started to do this, to think about, gee, if this is really the vision of where we could all be going as a research community, what is NICHD's specific role in this? What kinds of things should we be particularly supporting? How might we architecture? I was talking to some folks about this a little bit a while ago. How might we even redesign the way our institute is constructed to make sure that we're best equipped to support and move forward the research of the next 20 years, rather than simply being constructed to take advantage of the research of the last 20 years? So far we've had, as you can see here, some numbers. Of course, we want data wherever possible, that there have been over 700 people who have attended one or more of these vision meetings, representing 39 states in the U.S., 6 foreign countries. A total of 229 different institutions and organizations were part of this discussion. We also received, by now I think it's over 300 comments in response to the vision document from many different individuals and organizations. Here are logos of some of the organizations. Some of you will be members of some of these organizations who fed in things that were very useful to us, saying, gee, oh yeah, there's one there that Bob Blum knows, Guttmacher Institute. I've heard him mention it. I see their logo up there, actually. I didn't make this slide. It's nice they spelled the name correctly anyway, though. That also commented and suggested some other things we might look at. So I'd say we're off to a good start. I don't think the video link's going to work, so you'll just have to take my word we're off to a good start. We have some people interviewed at very much of the meetings talking about this. So these are the 9 scientific themes, and those of you who are more quantitatively inclined will actually notice that there are 10. I'd like to reassure you that the director of the NICHD actually can count at least up to 10. Beyond that, I have to take my shoes off, but I can count to 10. That's because the first 9 that you see shown here, we had separate meetings for, and then we realized the themes of both transdisciplinary science and how we get beyond just sort of saying, yes, this is important, to saying, well, great, how do we achieve it? And then also questions that were somewhat related in some ways. The career development were so important that when we had this final big meeting of a couple of hundred people, we wanted that to be a separate area of focus of attention, because it became clearer and clearer that we could talk about the science itself as much as we wanted to, but these 2 questions particularly needed some focused attention. So the kinds of key questions we were asking people to think about, again, were what are the key scientific opportunities, and to some degree what are the prioritizations amongst those. And then particularly think if these are scientific opportunities, what kinds of activities, what kinds of tools that maybe we don't have available now, or they're available in fairly rudimentary forms, what kinds of things should we be developing to allow us to really take advantage of these opportunities. So I'm going to now give you a very partial, sort of selective list of some of the thoughts that came forth from the vision meetings. This is not the organized document we'll have at the end of all of this, but just sort of a smattering of things that came forward, a little bit weighted to what we thought folks in the audience might want to hear, but there are lots of other things I could have gone into, but then we would have had no time for a discussion. Probably wouldn't have had time for lunch either, both of which are important, so I've tried to narrow it down a little bit. As you saw, we had one particular theme was in reproduction, though there was talk about this in lots of other areas as well. One of the points that was made was to think about human reproduction not just in the context of studies that are about human reproduction, but that it really did need to be included sexual and reproductive function in a much wider range of biomedical studies than is now the case, that many biomedical studies should be paying more attention to quality of life in general, but even those who often do pay attention to quality of life somehow do not tend to include sexual and reproductive function as part of quality of life. One of the nice things about NICHD is that we are in a position to be able to take a somewhat wider and I think more holistic view of health than many of our sister institutes. We're not focused on disease. We're really focused on, in many ways, health and development. It's in our name, after all. So that because of that philosophy and other reasons, this first point, that there's so much in terms of reproductive behavior and biology that we really don't have normative data for in adolescence, clearly a key transition in terms of human reproduction, and that we need to do a better job there. Some specific examples, but a more general conversation of the fact that as a field we need to be taking better advantage, it's not that it hasn't been done, but take better advantage of various unique, both emerging populations and situations, for instance, the African famine of now about 20 years ago, to use those unique sort of experiments of nature to look at such things as gene-environment interactions and development of reproductive and related endocrine disorders. What's the experience there, and to make sure that we mine that to understand it. Looking at various kinds of epidemiologic, genetic, genomic studies to look more closely at the etiology of both infertility and subfecundity in men and in women, both. That we need to have a better understanding of the basic biology of mammalian germline, that would be very useful in terms of, again, tools and approaches that might be useful to be able to extensively, and I mean really extensively, characterize very small numbers of cells, both male and female, at specific stages in development. Learning more about polycystic ovary syndrome, and I particularly would make a pitch for pelvic floor disorders. I think pelvic floor disorders clearly fall into the purview of NICHD, and I think this is an area where we have made way too little progress in the last few decades, and they're interesting, I think, sociological as well as biological challenges perhaps that have led to that. But in terms of understanding a whole slew of, basically, of a lot of women's health issues in which NICHD is involved, clearly fall within our mission statement. Things like fibroids, endometriosis, et cetera, as well, that we just really don't have the kind of progress we should be having. Investigate transitions that we need to pay better attention to the transitions here as windows of susceptibility to various kinds of disease, dysfunction, et cetera. Clearly, contraception, we're very aware at NICHD of our role in terms of contraception research, and this clearly falls again in the center, really, of our mission. So things will come as no surprise to this crowd that we need to have more options in terms of contraception, very specifically, and there's some promising work, but it's always sort of promising. We'd like to be able to deliver on it in terms of male contraceptive options. Molecular non-hormonal contraception, and also new contraceptive agents that are specifically targeted at different phases of the life cycle, that we have too long sort of simplified reproductive behavior and the biology of reproduction to think that you can come up with sort of a contraceptive method that's going to be useful for folks no matter where they are in terms of the life cycle. And in fact, that we shouldn't act that way. People don't act that way. And that we need to be more thoughtful about coming up with different contraceptive options for lots of reasons, including that at different points in life cycle, the same exact person may choose to rely on different options depending upon where in the life cycle they are, and certain ones may be more or less effective biologically as well at different phases of the life cycle. That clearly we need to have implementation science on contraception, safe sex, improved understanding of contraceptive behavior, and particularly this question about what factors influence use of agents, et cetera. We certainly have some knowledge of that, some of it emanating from this very school, but that we need to have more understanding of that. Pregnancy, both for when the contraceptive technologies don't work and when people choose not to use them, that there's lots that we need to understand about pregnancy that we don't. There was really two meetings where I kind of felt like I'd gone back to the movie The Graduate, and I was around the swimming pool, but instead of saying plastics, that people were saying placenta, 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 this is the future. That we have really under-regarded, many people would argue, the importance of the placenta in human life, and that we really don't understand it very well. And the degree that we tend to look at placental function, we too often look at the placenta at the very end of pregnancy, and we simply look at the histology of it, and we think somehow that gives us a window on the entire pregnancy, when clearly it doesn't. And what could we do to have better ways of really interrogating placental development and function throughout pregnancy? Obviously, the more non-invasive, the better. The idea of creating for the lab the placenta on a chip, et cetera. Sort of related in some ways, that it'd be great to have a really comprehensive 4D, that is, time really needs to be involved in this, models for in utero development, going from the basic cell all the way up, including gene expression, epigenetic phenomena, et cetera. Someone specifically called that we should work with Pixar to develop the virtual embryo. And that's an interesting, I do think, and you'll see there's some other calls there, that we should think about some methodologies beyond the traditional scientific ones to better understand what we do and to also convey it to the public. But a virtual embryo would be very interesting scientifically, and particularly interesting in terms of maybe getting young people interested in science. pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes. That we really don't understand ART nearly as well as we need to, and to be able to compare its effects to unassisted conception, as it's now sometimes called, and both to have animal models to do that, and also many people would argue better follow-up of those delivered or conceived through ART to see how that affects development, etc. Development molecular anatomy, epigenetic maps of development that go all the way from one cell embryo through implantation, etc., to better understand pregnancy loss. Another area that we certainly know much more about than we did a few decades ago, but we still don't understand that well. We don't even recognize, of course, most pregnancy loss, let alone understand it. Understanding what are the effects of obesity, and obviously with obesity growing worldwide as an issue, and lactation, other kinds of things like that on transgenerational development, including on gametes. New models of preterm birth prediction and risk assessment. We have terrible models in terms of being able to say we know something clearly about risk factors for preterm birth, but we really have got very little of use to be able to apply to a pregnancy or to have, for instance, early biomarkers of pregnancy to really say this is a pregnancy whose risk for preterm delivery is such and such, and therefore, based upon that, to be able to do randomized clinical trials of different interventions to really understand how we can do something about the huge number of preterm births which have great impact on the field. Better understand the relationship between pregnancy itself and women's health. This is an area that really has been understudied, though again some studies, but to look at various kinds of parts of pregnancy or pregnancy experiences and what they say about a woman's health. For instance, use of metabolic syndrome of pregnancy as a risk indicator in terms of later cardiometabolic health and disease. Preeclampsia, understand better its role as indicator of risk for in later life for stroke, hypertension, related cardiovascular disease. And really to understand to what degree is it that in pregnancy changes don't just indicate risk for future disease, but even themselves are a causative factor in terms of later disease. And the degree that it really is they are causative factors, what kind of interventions in pregnancy could make a difference in terms of that longer-term outcome in terms of women's health. Developmental origins. This is certainly an area I think that over the next 10 years, if you think, well, gee, if you're going to think about scientific opportunities in the next 10 years, they ought to be things that just not things, well, gee, we've been neglecting them for so long, why don't we do something with them? They ought to include some areas for sure where, gee, we have new tools, new understanding that we never had before to enable us to do that. I would argue this whole area that many of you will know about, it's often referred to as developmental origins of health and disease, or DOHAD, that is one of those areas that we have new tools, certainly in terms of having genome sequences available so we can look at birth or even earlier at the genetic sequence of an individual. But we have other kinds of tools as well, early biomarkers, etc. You know, we have for too long acted as though children don't become adults. There's child health and there's adult health. And if you're lucky and you're safe and you don't have injury and you get immunized well, you get through childhood and then you become an adult. And you eventually show up with adult health problems as though they somehow were unrelated. All you did is, you conquered childhood, so you get to enter adulthood, and that's it. Well, in fact, the child really is father of the man and mother of the woman. And not just the child, but in fact the fetus. So going back into, in fact, there's some preconceptional influences that are of importance here too. But to use many tools, some of us were talking about before about the National Children's Study, lots of different tools that should enable us to really begin to make those biological links. I can tell you there's huge interest around the NIH in this right now. Clearly demands that we walk and work across a lot of the sort of silos of different institutes at NIH to think about these kinds of things, but to really look at how these things, including maternal-fetal interactions, influence later health of the fetus, that is, the fetus to child to adult kind of thing. Interesting, for instance, in C. elegans, that mutations extend lifespan act only during development. Might there be some such in humans? Are there key windows very early in life that really do, to some degree, very much narrow what our future health is going to be, or widen it? And how do we understand that biologically so that we can make a difference? For instance, as someone who comes from a background of pediatrics, I really would foresee a day where anticipatory guidance, which is such an important part of pediatrics, isn't simply about here are the things to be thinking about in the next 6 weeks or 6 months of your child's health, but here are some things based upon what we know about your child as an individual to be thinking about for the next 60 years of your child's health. And to begin to think not just about that anticipatory guidance, but even potentially interventions in childhood that would have an impact in terms of adult health for that individual. In terms of thinking about developmental origins, engaging specific populations with unique biological characteristics or exposures, for instance, whether it be preterm infants, children born to mothers who are with specific diseases or special diets, how does that change things? And again, the placenta returns as a kind of record of gene-environment interactions. Prematurity, I've already mentioned a bit, but for instance, I think it's realistic. It would be nice if it were realistic to say in 10 years we're going to stamp out prematurity across the world. Ain't going to happen. It would be wonderful. It's not going to happen. But I think it is realistic to say that in 10 years we ought to be able to identify all of the causes, biological ones, social ones, environmental ones, of prematurity. We know a fair number of them, but there are many we don't know that don't completely explain prematurity. And because of the impact of prematurity, both in the U.S. and increasingly globally, as children are surviving more and more who are preterm, to think about how we can reduce prematurity is, I think, very important for us to do. How can we use new technologies to gather data and to educate as well about this, and to do a better job of both understanding, but even those that we understand, reducing the inappropriate interventions that cause preterm birth, such as inappropriate use of cesarean section. Behavior, this would be an hour talk in itself, all kinds of things, but just a sort of selection of some of the things that came from both the behavior workshop and later discussions about behavior. A better understanding of how new technologies influence behavior, particularly in children. Does it really, the fact that kids are growing up in a texting world kind of thing, that kids are growing up in a world that has very many different influences in the world that kids of even 20 years ago grew up with, how does that change behavior? Are there, in fact, as some early data would suggest, and some people suggest more firmly perhaps, to what degree is there any rewiring that's going on of our neurologic systems based upon early exposures to new technologies, etc.? Questions that we should certainly be looking at. That we need much better early markers of later pathological behavior, so we can target interventions earlier in the progression of these things. We're used to looking for early biomarkers of human disease, now looking at that, but what about early biomarkers of later behavior issues? Clearly, better understanding of gene-environment interactions as they both predict and cause behavioral outcomes of various sorts. Understanding, again, lots of work here about this, how behaviors lead to health disparities and vice versa, the relationship really between behaviors and health disparities. Understanding the developmental impact of various kinds of social institutions, whether they be the welfare system, incarceration, gangs, etc. Again, things that this school has been the vanguard of looking at. Despite being the vanguard, you still haven't solved all of that yet. This is an interesting sort of point that's obvious to many, but others haven't really thought of, and that is, in thinking about health education, that we need to get through this, past this sort of simplistic vision that many people have, that if you just, build it, they will come kind of thing, that we really need to focus on the barriers to people making what we would say are good choices, and to understand the reality of people's lives. And if we come up with some wonderful intervention that we think really should make a difference, and we then do health education around that, why is it that people who really do have the best interests of their children in mind, for instance, decide not to use the bicycle helmet, decide not to immunize, whatever it might be? What are those barriers, and what can we do to remove some of those barriers? The next point as well. Understanding from a more, sort of centrally biological point of view, how do variations in the same exact gene lead to such different behavioral and psychiatric outcomes? Apparently the same exact mutation, the same base change, why do we see such kinds of different impacts that they may have? What are the environmental factors that mediate the genetic ones? What are the other genetic factors in the individual that may mediate the impact of that mutation? Cognition, lots of interesting stuff here. As you can see, characterizing cognitive trajectories across the lifespan, looking at different domains in a rigorous kind of way, making sure that we do use age-appropriate measures as well as ones that work in different cultural settings, to identify not just pre-symptomatic, as useful as that would be, but in fact even perinatal and prenatal risk factors that tell us something about cognitive development. Expanding research beyond the proband, and to begin to look in a more thoughtful way at sex differences in cognition. To what degree does the individual biology influence cognition, including individual sex differences, so that we can understand that, and also so that we can remove those things where we see sex differences that are culturally based in terms of cognitive development, to think about which ones are culturally based and based on how we tend to interact with folks of different gender, as opposed to those which might be biologically driven, if any. Understanding differences in learning disorders and improving in identification of at-risk individuals, making it earlier in life, certainly something that, again, if you think, do we have new tools to do this? We do. I would argue that by understanding, again, the role of genetic factors in this allows us to control for those and even understand the environmental factors better in terms of thinking about learning disorders. Methods clearly to diagnose cognitive problems earlier in life than we do now. Better study the impact of such things as nutrition on cognitive development, and new instruments for assessing social cognition. Part of this obviously is getting a more complex view of cognition than we've had in the past, and recognizing that there really are different domains that we tend to lump together and just call it cognition. Diagnostics and Therapeutics, again, its own workshop and lots of different things. Early biomarkers for identifying treatable phenotypes. Real-life, long-term physiologic monitoring devices of various kinds of sorts that could be used. There clearly are some that are already becoming available, but lots of new technologies that would allow much better physiological monitoring for many conditions. The idea of bringing together consortia of researchers, we'll come back to that when I talk a bit about the interdisciplinary stuff, but consortia of researchers promote best practices in conducting clinical trials. To make sure that we're involving the social context as we think about mediators between markers and population characteristics. Repurposing of orphan drugs, already had a brief discussion of that this morning. The idea that drugs developed for one purpose can be used for another disease, and in fact, particularly drugs that have been jettisoned. They may have been developed, they may have even been through safety testing, etc., but then they did not have the impact, and it may not even be the medical impact. They may not have had the financial impact that was desired by the original drug company developing it, so they are abandoned, but they are still available. We know a lot about the mode of action. Maybe we be able to repurpose those for other conditions where they really could be used, both for positive impact and even do that in a way that at least doesn't lose money. Development of molecular targets for therapy, lots of, again, new tools for doing that, so-called chemical genomics and others that allow one to do that these days. We need clearly to be able to better predict the response of individuals to therapies and interventions. We're just beginning to be able to use pharmacogenetics to do that. We need to do a better job of it. The idea that we, for instance, should be able to engineer fibroblasts from a child with a neurologic disorder and engineer those fibroblasts into neurons, and then use those neurons to screen drugs in the lab for effectiveness at repairing the basic lesion. More of that kind of thinking. Clearly, the idea we should be studying more therapeutics in pregnancy forever. Many of you will know, have been involved in this. There have been lots of, for various reasons, refusal to study drugs in pregnancy. And that actually makes complete sense as well, as long as no pregnant woman is ever going to get ill. Otherwise, the fact that potentially at the most vulnerable part in a person's life, that is their fetal life, we have no idea about what use of this medication is going to do. I mean, that's just stupid. We need to be more thoughtful about how do we not just allow but encourage appropriate study of the use of drugs in pregnancy. Environment, and this was using the term environment incredibly broadly, as it should be, I think. But so just some few examples here again, that we need to get beyond simply poverty and SES as the defining characteristic of a social setting, and look at all of the other things that go into the social setting, whether it be availability of health services, what the built environment looks like, the presence or absence of very specific toxins and other hazards, social ties, stability, family structure, all those other kinds of things that we need to be looking at. And again, it's not this hasn't been happening, but it needs to be done more broadly and probably more deeply as well. And again, looking at the particular impact of environmental factors at different points in the life cycle, looking particularly at key developmental transition points and the focus particularly on those when we look at the influence of environmental factors. That we need to have better and particularly standardized measurements so one can look across studies at such constructs, and just to pick one, there are lots of them here, obviously, for instance, looking at parenting, and to really have a standardized way of looking at that and realize that parenting involves more than simply the mother as something important to look at. That we clearly as well need to, while we look at changing individual behavior, as the BedNet experience has shown us, as school menus have shown us, etc., we need to look at what are often more cost-effective means for improving health and well-being that may be applied at the societal level, sometimes without understanding the actual biology of exactly what's occurring. It's nice if we do, but being able to do things that really make a difference in terms of health outcomes and to be thinking more creatively about that. Also, in much of the thinking about the environment in terms of toxic exposures, the physical environment, etc., for way too long our focus has tended to be on high-dose toxic exposures in animal models, for instance, which are interesting, but don't often tell us that's so much about human experience, where it's much more common to have chronic low-dose or even universal ubiquitous exposures to agents, and that we don't tend to study as much. And that we should really make sure that we are looking at those, because if we're studying these things, particularly if they mirror the human experience, so that's what we need to do. Examining these things in various kinds of ways, including making sure we look at resiliency as a counterpoint to susceptibility. We often look at things that make people susceptible to various issues in environment, again, quite broadly, environmental exposures. We also will learn a lot from what is it that makes someone resistant to or even resilient from some kind of environmental exposure, to understand those better. We need to do a much better job of bringing technologies in from other fields to evaluate dose thresholds, etc. And again, this is beginning to be done as we use basic some geographic mapping techniques and other things to look at exposures. But there's a lot going on out there in other fields that we could be applying to our scientific research. And basically creating toolkits to allow researchers greater ability to collect valuable exposure and outcome data in the event of natural experiments. You know, this, for instance, some of this has been done in reaction to Katrina and other kinds of situations where we have an available toolkit to look at these natural experiments to let us understand better environmental exposures. As we get away from specific content areas, sort of more general themes that came up over and over again, I'd say at all of the workshops, issues regarding scientific data and how we treat it, etc. I would say, generalized call for the fact that data sharing plans should be part of a really huge percentage of applications for grants. And that doesn't mean the data sharing plan is we plan to present this at 3 meetings. It means how do you make the data available to other researchers? Clearly, I would say that not only has this occurred, but in some ways this is the most important scientific development of the last 10 to 15 years, and I like to think the Human Genome Project played some role in this, is the idea of getting away from the model where data belongs to the principal investigator, to the idea that data belongs to society, particularly if that data has been collected using federal dollars to generate it. And that, yes, we need to recognize the appropriate role of the PI in terms of intellectual contribution and recognize that in various kinds of ways, but at the same time, we need to get the data out there as broadly and as quickly as we can so that many people can be analyzing the data, comparing that data to other studies, to some of their own data, et cetera, so that it benefits knowledge and, more importantly, in the end, society. So making data available to the entire scientific community, better ways clearly to process, store, and analyze masses of data. We have now probably entered that age where getting the data is a relatively easy part. It's knowing what to do with these voluminous amounts of data that we have. This is getting true of more and more fields in research. How do we do that? So better ways of doing that. Again, more effective use of data gathered by commercial entities. Google knows a lot about how to gather data about behavior. We have not sort of stolen their methods as much as we should have, let alone work in concert with some folks like that about looking at human behaviors and other kinds of things as well. Their health vault system, other kinds of ways that they're really, they may leapfrog over the electronic medical record the way it's been thought of as, based on the hospital floor, and we should be utilizing some of those things. We can't simply say, well, the data, that's not, I'm not sure whether that's real yet, it hasn't been validated, but then when people apply for the validation study, not fund it, or even if it gets funded, then refuse to publish it because, well, gee, it's just a validation study. In fact, it's important to recognize the value of that. How do we really enhance scientific capacity in low resource settings, both domestically and particularly globally? And that's not enhance the ability to do science in those settings, but to enhance the scientific capacity of people in those settings themselves to participate in a meaningful way in research. Again, I think we've made some real progress in that in recent years, but not nearly the degree of progress we should make if we really want to have the best research. It will include the scientific capacity being available in various kinds of low resource settings to do that. Use of social media, new technologies, whether it be to measure diet or movement. There's some great new accelerometer kinds of things. Getting beyond the 3-day dietary recall, which is famously terrible at really measuring diet, to, for instance, using people's smartphones. Simply take pictures of everything they eat and then have that automatically analyzed by computers to be able to tell you their nutrient intake for the day kind of stuff. Linking studies in systematic ways, having studies, again, standardizing various ways that we conduct studies, since it's so infrequent that a single study really changes practice, whether it be individual medical practice or public health practices. So we need to, when we conceive of studies, do them in a way that links together better, and clearly better ways to merge large data sets than we currently have. Better IRB harmonization across multiple sites. More and more, if we're going to have multi-site research and often interdisciplinary research, getting beyond the way we've used IRBs, which I would argue often is simply to protect the research institution, has nothing to do anymore with protecting participants. So let's rethink the way we use IRBs, the way we do informed consent, so that it really does protect participants, but that also it does not create an endless series of hoops for researchers to have to jump through that don't have some sense. So are there ways to conduct, and again, there are already some models for this, but larger IRBs are the way that local IRBs can work together and electively cede certain parts of the responsibility to other IRBs. unfairly, I might say, to get the researchers and the participants more central in this thinking and have lawyers a little bit farther back in the thinking about IRBs. But anyway, should we have a national IRB specific construct for interdisciplinary team science, for instance? Some people called for. Methods to reduce bias. Randomized clinical trials are a wonderful gold standard often, but it ain't too shabby sometimes to settle for the silver or bronze standard instead of the gold standard. You need to do that sometimes. So how do we reduce bias when the randomized clinical trials does not make sense? And thought that should there be centralized archive of data on various health interventions and of evaluations of them, a centralized archive where a researcher could go, knowing sort of like clinicaltrials.gov or something, you could find the data on intervention trials that have been done in a centralized database and evaluations of them easily available. So transdisciplinary research, and this came up again. I think we've moved from an era when people sort of said transdisciplinary research or multidisciplinary research, why should we bother, to general buy-in that it's not the only way to do research, but it is an increasingly important way to do research. That's great if we have general buy-in to it. How do we actually do it? And that's not simply a question for the NIH. That's a question for academic departments, for schools, for all kinds of things of how you do that. So how do we break out of the traditional meetings we go to and make for transdisciplinary meetings and other kinds of events that really promote knowledge sharing across diverse groups of researchers? How do we reduce career risk for junior investigators? You probably can't do away with it by adding transdisciplinary criteria to tenure evaluations, grant reviews, etc. You know, what happens in an era when you might have made a real intellectual contribution but be author number 7 on a 14-person paper? How does a tenure committee look at that when that was really important work and made a real contribution, and we wouldn't know that had that researcher not done that? Well, review tenure committees tend not to look at that the same way they do at first authored papers. So how do we change that kind of way of thinking about things? How do we promote early in people's careers discipline crossing by attracting top students in non-biological sciences to have some experience in biology and vice versa? How do we really get that kind of experience? I think there's a couple of interesting conversations in all of this about that it's probably not realistic to think about people, many people, and being trained in more than one discipline in real depth, but be trained in one area in real depth, but then to achieve fluency in some other disciplines, so that you know, for instance, how to talk the jargon, read the literature of the other disciplines. Importantly, you know how to frame questions in a way that the tools of other disciplines could be used, that you know how to do that in a way that's going to attract people from other disciplines to want to work with you, etc. The use of online tools to enable diverse research communities to look at questions together, etc. Training researchers in different disciplines, etc. Creating more of a culture of investigation that, for instance, might include teachers, if you want to learn about learning disorders or other events in child's lives even, to involve teachers as part of the research team in a meaningful way, clinicians, etc. This was an interesting idea I'd never heard of before, but it's really kind of an interesting. If we believe in multidisciplinary research, what about group sabbaticals? Not as the only way to take a sabbatical, but might there be something to be said for sending, 4 or 5 people from different diverse backgrounds off together for a few months to really think about some research problem together, to get to know each other, but more importantly, to get to know each other's perspectives. There's some knowing glances. Maybe someone's done this experiment. I'd love to hear about it. To really learn something about, again, the jargon of the other field, what tools might you have to approach this together, and to conceive of the experimental design together. Is that something that could be useful? The way we think about things, that we have too long in terms of health research thought about human life as always a dichotomy. There is healthy versus unhealthy. And when you do the research, you either check this person is healthy or they are unhealthy. Trying to act as though human existence is this you know, binomial kind of thing, whereas in fact so much of human life is on a spectrum. Typical development versus atypical development, obese versus non-obese. You suddenly gain a pound, and now, according to your BMI, you are obese. Whereas the next day you have some fluid loss or something, you're no longer obese. Well, a miracle has happened. Um, but that's not the way life works, and so we need to look at those things which exist in a spectrum with dimensional systems, which have real advantages, greater power to detect effects, etc. Sometimes having the bimodal distribution is really helpful, but often it just gets in the way of really understanding the way things work. Are we making sure that research effectively anticipates and addresses changing morbidities, mortalities, and lives? I know of at least one person in the audience will be happy for me to say, for instance, if you look at child morbidity and mortality in the United States, and you actually look at what are the leading causes of mortality in children's life, then you would say we should be focusing most of our research dollars on preventing injury, that we have conquered most of the scourges of infectious disease for kids in the United States. We need to make sure we still get them immunized, etc. But if you look at what are the current and foreseeable mortalities, that's what we should be thinking about. Again, in terms of getting away from simplistic thinking, getting beyond the two-level cause and effect models we often have to the much more sort of arboreal way that human existence really happens. Some interesting sort of philosophic kinds of consideration. When we talk about improving people's lives, particularly children's, but others as well, who's it gets to define improving? And how does that happen, and how does that shift by culture, by time? Who's appropriate to be making those decisions? When we talk about social deviance, who gets to define what deviance is? Deviance is usually that which someone else does. So how do we define that, et cetera? How do we distinguish between social definitions of function? For instance, if you look at children, often there are definitions of function that have to do with qualification for special education, and that may be very important in that world, but realize that's not really a scientifically based nosology. That is a access to academic support kind of nosology, and not to get the two confused, which we often do. This is, I think, an interesting philosophic thing. We've so long looked at disabilities in terms of the negative implication in this, whether you want to talk about intellectual disability, an acquired physical disability, whatever it is, that we should probably have a richer consideration of what are the positive impacts upon the individual, the family, of society, of disabilities, of chronic disease even. We live to stop chronic disease, but chronic disease may actually have some value. And to better understand that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to prevent chronic disease, but to have a fuller understanding of its true impact, again, on the individual, the family, and on society. So I hope that's kind of whetted your appetite. For those of you who haven't visited it, you can go to our website, or if you just put NICHD Vision in your search engine of choice, you'll come to this page, which continues to put up documents about these kinds of things and goes into much more detail than I was able to here, and just sort of talking about what's coming out of this discussion. Because at the end of the day, again, what we really want to do is just catalyze discussion. So we're hopeful that, I think we have a little time left right now for some discussion, but that also that you all will sort of have discussions among yourselves in whatever sort of groupings make sense, to think about where should we be going scientifically. We'd be very happy to hear about those in any kind of way. As you think about that, whether that way be by giving us great grant applications, or by simply saying, gee, somebody should have a conference on such and such, we're interested in that. So let me stop there and hear any questions, thoughts, discussions. How come such and such wasn't there? Maybe because I threw a bunch of slides out, or there may be, gee, we forgot to think about that. So, who has the guts to go first? Bob, you got to introduce me, so you can go first. Hold. Oh, that's right. We're being recorded, so watch out. Somebody may watch you someday. Don't say anything that will embarrass your mother. I've tried not to embarrass mine. Laura, you can tell me later whether I've done that.
So, as you think about this, is very far-ranging.
Yeah.
And both an extraordinary list and an extraordinary vision. Talk, if you will, what does this mean about education for the future as you think about it? What are the kinds of professionals that we don't have now that you think about? What are the kinds of trainings that we don't have now that you think about?
Yeah. I mean, certainly my initial thought about that, Bob, is to get exactly this multidisciplinary thing. How do we create people who can enter careers where they really are going to work collaboratively, that they're going to, because I think, again, it's getting, we now have the ability to get beyond the sort of simplistic questions. There's still some simple questions that we still have to answer. And there will be a real role for somebody who wants to focus on one molecule and spend their whole life just figuring out that one molecule, that wants to look at that one behavior and figure it out. But even for that one molecule person and the one behavior person, more and more they're going to want to use tools that come from other disciplines. So it is giving people the ability to be able to go across disciplines to figure out how to access other literature, other people, those kinds of things. And some of that is, I think, actual, of course, didactic kind of thing, making sure that the experience they get in terms of basic, I would argue, I have a bias, obviously, from my genetics background, that for many areas of health research, if not all, that somebody entering that needs to have a basic vocabulary and, probably more important, lack of fear of genetics if they are going to be able to use that appropriately. Does that mean that people need to be able to go through exactly how the cell cycle occurs and where, the replication of DNA? Absolutely not. But it means having enough of a facility to be able to read papers about that, to conceive of what experiment might make sense for what I'm doing that's going to use those different tools. Some of it also, I think, is modeling, and that is the modeling of those of us a little farther along, of being open to doing that, of working across disciplines, of using tools from other disciplines, et cetera. I can tell you the most important part of my medical school education, I think, was one day in the library when I was a first-year medical student. And I was taking the introductory biochemistry course, so all 150 of us were in the same biochem course. And I was in the medical school library at lunch break. I think probably, I'd like to say I was reading, I don't remember, reading the notes for the lecture that was coming up that afternoon. I was probably reading the notes for the lecture that occurred last week that I hadn't done ahead of time. Anyway, I was reading something, and I got up and was walking across in the sort of central area, and I saw the guy who was the head of the biochemistry course sitting there. And he was reading. This didn't surprise me. I thought professors at Harvard read. I was not surprised by that. But he was reading a physics journal. This I found unusual. So he recognized me. I'm not quite sure why. That may not have been a good thing. He recognized me. And I said, sort of nicely, I can't help but notice you're reading a physics journal. Don't you know you're a biochemist? And he said something about, a couple days a week, I allow myself to come to the library, and for about 90 minutes, I purposefully read stuff that's outside of biochemistry. Everybody who does biochemistry is, oddly enough, a biochemist. I find that I make my most novel contributions to the field when I bring in something from some other perspective. So it's not always physics that I read, but I come a couple times a week and read journals from outside biochemistry because I see what's the latest science in those areas, what new tools people have, and that occasion just makes me think of some new approach to a problem that I've got at the bench, or even some new tool that somebody in the physics community is using. I think, gee, could we adapt that to this problem kind of thing? So that's where I make my real contributions. That was a wonderful teaching. I mean, again, I don't remember anything else in the biochemistry course. I think there's something called the Krebs cycle, maybe, I'm not sure. But that was really useful to me. So I think that kind of just looking for those opportunities is important as well. Wherever the microphone wants to go next, I'll pass off this responsibility.
Thank you very much. It's a very useful and exhaustive list.
Yeah, exhaustive
I
for
wonder
sure.
if you
Exhausting list.
I wonder if you have any plans to develop a list of priorities. For example, what are the top 10 topics that we need to deal with in the next 10 years?
As a matter of fact, you'll be interested to know when there were these 9 different workshops, we did not explicitly demand that of folks. We said, give us your best ideas. So when we came to this last workshop, we actually said, give us, each group, your 3 to 6 best ideas. You don't have to put them in order, but give us your 3 to 6 best ideas. Because at the end of the day, we certainly, that's where it gets to the role of NICHD, we're going to have to do that. This vision document that we're coming together, bringing together, is not going to be able to have all this stuff in it. So that's really the challenge that's facing us right now, to come down to what really are the primary opportunities. So we are working on that now, and it will be in this publication that will show up at the end of this year kind of thing. It's important, though, at the same time, that just because something doesn't, lands on the cutting room floor doesn't mean it's not important, and might be more important than things we include. So we don't want to discard ideas just because they're not on our current, sort of most promising list. But we do, at the same time, I think, are going to have to do that both this article, but more importantly, as we move forward as an institute, particularly in the current budget climate, we're not going to be able to do all of these things. Now, we're hoping one of the reasons for having lots of other institutes involved in this, et cetera, we're hoping that there'll be other sectors of the NIH, and in fact, other sectors of all kinds of funders, et cetera, that will find pieces of this that, while they may not be a priority for us as an institute, they see as priorities for them for funding, for supporting, et cetera. But I think, just to pick a couple of examples, from our mission point of view, doing something about prematurity, hugely important, I think, in terms of this developmental, looking at really developmental antecedents to adult, what we've always thought of before as adult onset health and disease, but really will often have onset of at least preclinical situation in childhood, to be doing those. Those are, I think there are some things like that that come up as real. I think in terms of more contraception more contraceptive options, that's something else. There are certain things that are particularly important.
Thank you for that extensive list. But one topic that I didn't hear mentioned was the fact that at the end of your 10-year horizon, the world population will be more than 9 billion people, with a lot of issues that have to be addressed, fertility being one of them, should be within the province of NICHD. What activities are going on to consider these issues, work with people who are involved with them, et cetera?
Sure. And part of it, obviously contraception is part of that, but it's only not a small part, it's only a part of that kind of thing. And to look at, again, I think, for instance, some of the things to understand more fully reproductive behavior is important. A lot of this obviously gets beyond human reproduction, has to do with sustainable agriculture, the effects of urbanization of the world, all those kinds of things. So I think that we'll play some role in that. Much of that, while, yes, falling into our mission area, is going to be done by folks who have even more focus and more expertise in that, et cetera, than we do. Other parts of the U.S. government, other kinds of NGOs, et cetera. Clearly, those are important. And I think, again, it's not just the size of the population. It is, the question of urbanization of the world, et cetera, et cetera. All of those have huge impacts. Even if you look at the more narrow focus of the NICHD on children's lives, well, there's huge impact on children's lives alone, simply from those factors. So yeah, I think they need to be looked at, et cetera. They're very important. Get a little bit, I think, beyond our core mission kind of activities to things that we're quite interested in nonetheless.
Well, I think because of the time, I know we could stay here all afternoon, but we're going to need to break. But please join me in thanking you.